From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the protests that have swept across Lebanon over the past week. To discuss what's driving them and where things might be headed, we've got an all-star cast of guests on today's program, including Paul Salem, Randa Slim, and Bilal Saab. Paul is the president of MEI. Randa is a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. And Bilal is a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Defense and Security program. All are longtime Lebanese politics watchers. On today's program, we're going to do things a little bit differently. Due to the vagaries of scheduling, the program's going to be divided into two parts. First, we'll be talking to Paul, and then second, we'll be talking to Randa and Bilal. Enjoy today's program. Paul, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
You were just in Lebanon earlier this week. Can you give us a sense of what the mood there is like and what's driving these protests?
Yeah, I had the good fortune to be in Lebanon during this time. I was there for a conference, but then this uprising broke out. I spent a number of days on the streets protesting with colleagues and friends and met with a number of the organizers. This is a very, very massive uprising, is what I'd call it. If we look back at 2005, the uprising then was against foreign occupation, essentially foreign control, which was the Syrian presence and led to the departure of Syrian forces from Lebanon. This is an uprising against the Lebanese ruling elite, against the domestic ruling elite, although it also touches on Hezbollah's influence, Hezbollah being very much supported by Iran as well. So it's a very, very major uprising, obviously hard to count actual numbers, but easily over 1 million or 1.5 million. It's taking place in all parts of the country. Beirut, obviously, one sees a lot on the press, but Tripoli, the second biggest city, has massive protests. There's also protests in various towns and villages in the mountains, and very significantly, protests in the south, which didn't occur very much in 2005. Those are the Shiite areas controlled by Hezbollah and their ally Amal.
So while the immediate catalyst for these protests may have been the kind of what's up tax and the bump in VAT rates, there's clearly a lot more going on here. Would you think it's fair to say this is really about a fundamental loss of confidence by the people in the ruling elite?
Yeah, this has been accumulating over many years. There were some initial movements like this at the beginning, actually, of the Arab Spring. They didn't take much steam at the time. Then there were other protest movements. You might recall the You Stink movement over the enormous garbage crisis that plagued the country. So there's been an accumulation of things. Even in a couple of weeks ago, there were massive forest fires in the country, which it additionally showed the ineptness of the government in dealing with any of the country's problems. Underlying this in a very fundamental way is a dramatic decline in the economic fortunes of the country. The economic growth is around zero, expected to be in negative territory. There's a huge a crisis in the banks. Dollars are very difficult to come by. There's a very great liquidity crisis, pressure on the Lebanese pound. All of this while the people who are suffering from these economic consequences, a lot of them indeed driven into poverty, some into hunger, people who, were not in that situation just a few years ago. So real economic pressure at a time when they look at their politicians who are thoroughly corrupt, enriching themselves, and unable to deal with the country's problems or the country's economy, but very happy to make deals amongst themselves and to enrich themselves. So it was really a case of accumulated disgust that was then, the last straw was these additional taxes that the government was proposing.
Can you give us a sense of who these protesters are and what they want?
Well, it's all different kinds of people. I would say the bulk of them are citizens who've had enough, rather than, yes, there's some civil society groups, some which date back to the You Stink movement or date back to the municipal elections of a couple of years ago in Beirut, other civil society groups in other parts of the country. Maybe those would account for a minority of protesters. But the fact of the matter is that citizens of all stripes, of all ages, of all communities, of all regions, share a perception that their politicians are corrupt, the system is inept, the economy is going over a cliff, the ruling oligarchy is unwilling and unable to sort of fix or save the country or fix the issues that need fixing. So the bulk of the protesters are people who just, seeing things develop on social media and people beginning to go on the streets, decided to get out of their homes and go to the streets as well. And now the protests themselves have kind of a life of their own, a collective, almost a festival spirit. People discovering that they have power in numbers, that this power in numbers crosses sectarian lines. There's sort of a celebration of Lebanese unity and a sense that the people are united to a large degree against an oligarchy which has tried to keep them apart for a long time.
Do you have a sense of what the protesters are demanding? As you alluded to, this is a kind of a mass movement, broad-based, without seemingly a clear leadership.
That is true. It's a mass movement. There is some leadership, or at least coordination, let's say, that is taking place. Some of the groups getting together, trying to issue demands. It hasn't cohered into one clear sort of national representation for this movement that might develop over the next few days, since I think this protest is going to take a long time. When we look at Sudan, how long it took there, and some other countries, and people in Lebanon do look to Sudan as a recent example. So I think leadership, maybe over time, at least committees and coordination is taking place. The demand is direct and simple. They want, it might be ambitious, but their demand is clear. The toppling, if you want, of this corrupt oligarchy in total. And they include in that the president, the prime minister, the government, speaker of parliament, and also they include many of them, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, as part of this kind of ruling clique that has been dominating the country for the last few decades. They want the removal of all of that. Now, how can that translate into reality? The sort of near-term translation of that would be the resignation of the government, prime minister and government, and the formation of an alternative government, ideally from their point of view, of civil society, of technocrats, people who are independent from the oligarchy and political parties that can take control at least of the executive branch for now and deal with the pressing problems. Then they would want to go to early elections or parliamentary elections in order to try to supplant the oligarchy, which, after all, does win most of these elections. So there is an election challenge that would come later down the road.
Finally, the government's kind of initial response after a 72-hour deadline that it gave itself, Prime Minister Saad Hariri gave a much-anticipated speech on Monday in which he announced a package of reform measures, some aspirational, some populist, including halving MPs and government ministers' salaries. How was that received? And it sounds like, from what you already said, that's not going to be enough.
No, it's not enough at all, because they say, well, this group has been in power for the last couple of decades. They're the ones who got us to where we are today. They are responsible for it. They are the ones deeply mired in corruption. How can we expect that they will suddenly, in 72 hours, change their stripes and become something else? So for the protesters, it's pretty clear what their position is that they all must go. And when you look into the announcement made by the prime minister, limited as they are, but they have some significance in them. At the same time, they're very aspirational. He claims that the budget of 2020 will have pretty much a zero deficit. That's effectively, somewhat impossible for them to achieve, given that they're running a 9 to 12% deficit now. And what's to say, just because they made a promise on a Monday, that they will be able to follow through to that. Very sort of speculative. They said the banks would offer $3 billion. The banks are on the brink as it is. The banks are closed. It's uncertain when they do open in a few days what their situation will be. So the banks, claim that they will give $3 billion is kind of a pie in the sky claim. The idea of dealing with the electricity sector and the telecom sector, very complicated files, very difficult to achieve. So what the prime minister announced was largely aspirational, realistically very difficult to achieve, and has no credibility in the public, and proof being that effectively nothing changed after the announcements. The protests only got bigger.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but thank you for joining the podcast today, Paul.
Thank you, Alistair.
Randa, Bilal, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
We're just about a week into the protest, and Prime Minister Huri's speech on Monday and the reforms that he laid out seem not to have dampened the protests. Where does this leave the government, and what are its options, Randa?
Look, the government, there is a standoff right now between the government and the protesters. And it's clear that the reform package proposed by Hariri, including, after the meeting of the cabinet, have not met or are not seen, on one hand, credible, and on the other hand, as enough in terms of the protesters' demand. However, I would like to basically stress here the importance that what's happening in Lebanon is, in a way, a continuation of the Arab Spring that we have seen in 2011. When the Arab Spring happened in 2011, we had three countries that did not participate at the time, or that did not witness uprisings like like has happened in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen. And the three countries were, at the time, Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And it's interesting that it is now these three countries that are experiencing this uprising, and the uprising are fueled and driven pretty much but by what drove the uprising in 2011, which is the corruption, which is the governance issues, nepotism, the need for a new compact between citizens and the government. And we are now starting to hear in Lebanon, which we have not heard before in previous protests in Lebanon, 2015, 2005, which is the fall of the regime. And this is the slogan again of the Arab uprisings.
Bilal, you're a longtime observer of Lebanese politics as well. What stands out to you about these protests? What's most notable and different this time around?
I think a lot of people have mentioned it. Just its geography. It's the fact that it includes all communities. Remember 2005 Cedar Revolution, as the world came to know it, there was one missing community, and that's the Lebanon's Shiites, right? This time around, we don't know the numbers, but at least we know where they are protesting, and in places where we never expected them to, right? So that's what makes it really unique. Just people from all walks of life joining the struggle and making it complete in a way where it wasn't in 2005.
It's also important to remember that in 2015, with the Youth Think movement, a lot of the protesters were Shia. A good part of the leadership core of the 2015 protest movements were Shia. And many of them are now part of the leadership core of this protest movement. Protest against the garbage happened in Shia majority towns. So again, we have to take what's happening in the Shia street as not something that has not happened before. It has happened before, but the difference this time is that it is, the address that's being sent to is clearer. In 2015 it was the government. Now it's clearly Nabih Berri, who is one of the Shia duopoly. But Shias have always been part of the protest starting in 2015.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, look, also, we didn't see Shiite protesters with the garbage crisis tearing down the pictures of Nabih Berri. So you're absolutely right, Randa. And we didn't see people condemn Hassan Nasrallah over YouTube videos and what have you. So the audacity of it is certainly unique.
As an outside observer, one of the things that's most notable is the fact that you are seeing communities publicly criticizing their leaders in a way, especially with Hezbollah and Nasrallah, that you haven't really seen before.
Yeah, I mean, this is a price that Hezbollah has to pay for being a political party. I call it Hezbollah is now experiencing his Berrization moment. If you are part of a corrupt governing formula, governing structure, you are going to be blamed. Although I have to say, which is interesting in the way that the Shia street has been, protesting, if we can put it this way, definitely the protest against Nabih Berri. And I have to say that the break between Nabih Berri and the rest and the Shia community has been there for a long time. So it's not something recent. So it has been there, and for anybody who has been following the dynamic inside the Shia community, that break has been, in place for some time. And Birri retains whatever power he has because of Hezbollah and not because of his stature or Amal stature. That's one. But two, what we are still saying is there is this wall. So yes, few video here and there against, Nasrallah, but in the streets, people are not blaming Nasrallah for the corruption or linking Nasrallah, or saying Nasrallah is part of the corrupt formula. What they are saying is Nasrallah is to be held. What they are calling on Nasrallah is to do something, about this corrupt formula. They haven't yet laid the blame for the corruption, for the governance at Nasrallah's door. That's the difference.
Okay, so is it really that different? I mean, when you're endorsing the government that is responsible for all the corruption and you're the main architect of the government, I mean, how really different is it for the protesters? Why does it matter?
I mean, it matters because, again, look, I have said it that in the recent past, when people are starting to basically address Nasrallah the way they are addressing Nabih Berri today in the protest, and I mean by Shia, then that's the beginning of change. As long as we are not there, I'm not saying there is not a beginning, there is not a change in that relationship between Hezbollah and the Shia community. Of course, there is a change. But as long as they are still basically abiding by certain red lines, and this red line is pretty apparent when you look at the protest in terms of where the blame is being hurled publicly at, and the tone being used, and how it's being, how Hezbollah and Nasrallah are being addressed. So that's important. I'm not saying it's not different than before. Of course it's different. And partly because in the past few years, Hezbollah's contract with the community has changed. Hezbollah's ability to finance the social networks, provide jobs to Shia, which have been part of that contract between Hezbollah and the Shia, has been broken by Hezbollah, partly because of sanctions on Iran and the inability of Iran to, send enough money for Hezbollah, and partly because of US sanctions on Hezbollah and denying Hezbollah access to, financing, which has been in the past used to be able to grease the social security infrastructure, which Hezbollah has provided as part of its contract with its community.
Bilal, what do you see as being the longer-term impact for Hezbollah?
I mean, when we talk about lofty goals of disarmament, right, the end of its firm alliance with Iran, the serious break in its special bond with its constituency, I mean, all of these were always high bars. So this is not really what we're talking about here. And I think Randa has alluded to it. This is just a bad look. It's a bad look for the organization. It's always had firm control of the constituencies, right? Despite the fact that they brought utter destruction on the community with the grave mistake of 2006, the war against Israel, the guy came out on television and said, "I'm sorry." And they believed him. This is different. This is different. And it shakes its confidence. And I don't know what that means practically, okay? But I would love to see a Hezbollah that is a little bit more, and I'm not going to see it, but I would love to see a Hezbollah that's a little bit more humble, that's a little bit more vulnerable, and really cautious about its every move as it affects the interests of its constituency. This all now is in flux. And as you said yourself in your introductory remarks, this situation is very fluid as far as the economic crisis. And they don't have a silver bullet, a solution to it anytime soon. Not them, not the entire government. And so as this thing worsens and you start seeing more and more cracks, not just within Nabih Berri's constituency, but Hassan Nasrallah's constituency, this could become really interesting.
Look, I mean, people are poor. People are poor across Lebanon. Middle class had been impoverished, has been decimated. And this has left its impact in the Shia community as in the Sunni community, as, everywhere else. I don't like to use this sectarian identification because I think it's all Lebanon. And in fact, if the protests have achieved one thing, is that it has denied the ruling class from using the sectarian card.
Right.
In fact, that's a very important part of the protest in the Shia majority stronghold, is that this is now a national issue. It's not like in 2005, Hezbollah can come out in the street and said, this protest in the other street is against us.
Yep.
It cannot sell this narrative to its people. Everybody has been impoverished. Everybody is suffering. Everybody has owned the issues. And that's the problem. That's where I agree with Bilal, is that I don't think it is that anxious, but it faces it with major quandary, is that there is an issue here, socioeconomic issue. They don't have the means to solve it.
Yep.
It's not totally in their control. But unless they do something about it, they're going to have more and more dissenters inside the community. That's their problem. That's now their quandary and how to go about it. While at the same time, as Nasrallah said in his speech last week, he wants to preserve this regime. He wants to preserve this ruling formula when people, even among in the Shiite communities, are saying this regime, this ruling, formula, this oligarchy is not working for us. That's the struggle for Hezbollah, is how to be able to meet the expectations that their constituents have put on them while preserving the status quo, which is important for Hezbollah, not for domestic reason as much as for regional geopolitical reasons.
Exactly. And we'll talk about being in a bind, right? So it's one thing to use violence against fellow Lebanese from other sects, as they did in 2008. Can you imagine if they can afford doing that against their own constituency? This is really a tough question for the leadership of the organization.
And they cannot do it. And I don't see them going to use force or violence. I think Nasrallah's speech last week identified their roadmap. I think what we have seen recently in terms of this limited show of force of people showing up on mopeds that have originated, by the way, in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is pretty much controlled by Hezbollah, going to downtown Beirut. I mean, it's a warning signal that, violence, civil disorder can happen. I think what Nasrallah said in his speech, which is, I think, gives us an idea of what their plans, although I think what they're going to do is try to, as much as possible, try to push for negotiation between the regime and the protesters as much as possible. I think what we heard from Nasrallah is that if push comes to shove, we are going to bring our people in the street and then say, it's not only one street, which is we are seeing today protesting against the regime. There is another street, which is very much Hezbollah constituents, and those demands have to always be met. So what they can do through that is push for compromise, for negotiation. That's where they want. They want a negotiated, solution out of this that will require concessions from the regime. I think they will be the first to admit. The question is, this negotiated solution, to be credible to their supporters, has to include, or has at least to include, basically ditching Nabih Berri, their major Shiite ally, because he has been the focus of anger within the Shia community, but also ditching Gibran Bassil, who is being, he is like the main now focus of anger across all the communities. And those are two important allies to Hezbollah. I don't know if Hezbollah, for the price of the negotiated compromise they want, will they be ready to ditch Berri and Bassil? No,
you're absolutely right. And I think, if history, is an indicator, you're right. This is what they would probably do, like just wage a counter demonstration. But as proven also consistently throughout history, in the throes of revolution and uprising, it really is difficult to control the street, especially when that street is boiling. So as much as they want to avoid violence against their own community, that stuff could still happen. And even the perception of it, right, even the likelihood of that happening, I'm sure worries Hezbollah's leadership. But I agree with you that that's not their preferred course of action, but they might not be able to prevent it.
I think they are betting that the ISF, the internal security forces, and the army will play that role of a mediator if come if time comes to have two streets, between the two streets. And so I think you're right. I agree with you. When you have crowds, when you have mass movements, violence can happen. But I think there is an interest, at least in all within the political spectrum, of avoiding violence across the board. And I think there is less interest in regional neighbors because of their own woes and challenges of getting involved and try to manipulate the situation in Lebanon to their interest.
Yep. We're running short on time, but Bilal, I wanted to get your thoughts on why this matters for the U.S. and what the role for U.S. policy should be here.
Yeah, sure. Just very quickly. I mean, once again, unrest in Lebanon, and question resurfaces, what should we do about it? Okay, this is not the first time that this happens, not the first time that we're faced with this predicament. And yet, once again, we face ourselves with the question of, why does this matter? Well, it matters for three reasons. If the country goes to hell, I think the Syrian refugee crisis is going to get much worse. So this is a big problem for the Europeans and for the rest of the international community. I don't need to dwell on that. We've seen the consequences already. It could also pave the way for the return of ISIS across the borders and possibly even infiltrate further in the country, especially now that we've retreated in Syria. Just geopolitically, and Randa has addressed it before, we cede Lebanon to the Russians. You can kiss goodbye to the global power competition, which is our number one priority in national security strategy and national defense strategy. We also abandon the country. The Russians, the Iranians will pounce, right? And they're the ones who stand to benefit the most. And so the maximum pressure campaign also goes to hell if we don't do enough in Lebanon. And then just the southern border. I'm always concerned about the southern border, right? So if total chaos happens in Lebanon, I think that southern border is not going to be stable. Maybe because the Israelis would see an opportunity to pounce at Hezbollah when it's probably most vulnerable. And the president has made it very clear he wants to avoid a confrontation with the Iranians, right? So, and I suspect that if there is a conflagration across the borders, it's not going to be limited to the borders. It will certainly involve the Iranians. It'll probably be a regional affair. So for all these reasons, I think we have every interest in preserving the stability of Lebanon. Then it becomes a question of, how do you do that?
Great. Before we wrap up, any final thoughts where you see things going from here?
Yeah, I want to, rather than seeing where things are going here, I want to really, stress the importance, stress what a beautiful moment this is for Lebanon.
Right.
Seeing people across the country, shedding sect-based identities, focusing on their common challenges as citizens of Lebanon. And I think a lot of, praise has to go to the work that has been put in the country by civil society organization, by Lebanese, with the assistance of outside help, Europeans, Americans, others, also funders, on developing a healthy civil society sector in Lebanon, developing the culture and knowledge of non-violence protests, and also work that has been done with Lebanese security groups, security organizations, be it the police, be it the anti-riot group, force, be it the army, on the importance of protecting, on their role as protectors of the right of citizens to free expression. And we have seen in full display in the last 2 days in terms of the army stepping in at critical points to basically maintain the right of the protesters, to continue to protest, but at the same time, preventing basically thugs from coming in and disrupting this. So what is happening today is a tipping point of cumulative of work, of years and years of Lebanese working together on peace building, civil society, political participation. And so what we are seeing here is not just a coincidence. It's a result of hard work that has taken years to mature. And the political maturity of the street, of the people in the street, is a perfect example of this.
So I ended with, what we should do, right? So it would be silly for me not to say a word. And I'm on the record saying that in the piece that I offered for MEI. So because these ruling elites cannot save the country, I think we should support the creation of an emergency government made up of technocrats with a clear mandate and a clear timeline. And a lot of friends of mine in Lebanon, a lot of people in Lebanon want also accountability. And they don't want the politicians to get away with murder, but I think that's a fight for another day. I think the immediate priority today is to navigate this ship to safety. And the only people who could do it is really professionals at this point, certainly not the ruling elites who got us into this mess. There's a way Washington could do this, and it's certainly behind the scenes. Very quietly, we don't want a kiss of death phenomenon with Lebanon. We don't want our adversaries to say that we've created the uprising. I mean, it'll happen anyway. But we should conduct our diplomacy behind the scenes, and we have leverage. There's a reason, as Randa said, why we've invested for more than a decade in the Lebanese armed forces. It's exactly for moments like this. And for now, they've made the right decision to clamp down on the supporters of Hezbollah and Amal, to try to sort of clamp down on the uprising. Continue that quiet diplomacy and support the creation of a technocratic government.
Can I add something quickly? It's very important to keep the focus on the Lebanese quest for good governance and against corruption, and not shift the narrative to it is against Hezbollah, it's against Iran, because every time we do that, we lose in the Middle East. Back channel diplomacy, as Bilal said, and keep the focus on the governance reforms and the fight against corruption.
Exactly right.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but this is definitely a situation that we'll be keeping a close eye on. And thank you very much to all of our guests for joining the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on the program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.